Anyway, first of all, thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and Emily and Will, and hopefully Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're all very busy people, so we really do appreciate it. Um, so I'm pleased, as Anne mentioned, to briefly introduce the paper, which needs to be brief because it was probably a little bit long. I got carried away with my research, as I often do. So the paper, as Anne said, is designed to think about or to initiate thoughts about Labour's strategy, political strategy going forward, in with the background, of course, the disappointing by-election result, and the fact that tomorrow there's another by-election, and there are worrying signs, although who knows, it's an election, we shouldn't jump the gun, but there are worrying signs again about what it might turn up tomorrow. So I, like Emily, I think, used to be in the dark days of my youth a communications consultant and a political strategy consultant in Brussels when it was still a good career choice for a young boy from Yorkshire to go across to Brussels to work in EU relations. And so the paper is really based around how, as a communications consultant and public affairs consultant, we would tend to construct a political strategy. And that is, to simplify the paper, it is firstly, what are your objectives? So as we all know, the objective is to win elections and to form the next government. Secondly, the who question, so what is the audience? Thirdly, the messages, which includes both narrative and policy and messages around the policy. And lastly, tactics. How do you get from where you are now to where you want to be? So I'll start by talking about audience, which is also extremely interesting, of course, when we consider the shifting political tectonics going on in the UK at the moment, especially post-Brexit. So as Jonathan Friedland has argued, there's a realignment underway in British politics, and in his words, it is killing Labour. The Tories' crushing win in Hartlepool is proof that Boris Johnson's 2019 election victory wasn't a one-off, and working people, he says, in towns across England that once saw voting Labour as really part of their identity, are now voting Conservative and in large numbers. This is, of course, for Labour is extremely bad news, especially considering its precipitous drop in support in Scotland. Electoral mathematics mean Labour simply cannot win an election without these so-called red wall seats. So as Friedland explains, if Labour wants to survive as a potential party of government, it can't solely rely on what seems to be its new electorate, which is young people who live in a city, have a university degree, or are from an ethnic minority, because there simply aren't enough of those people, and there aren't enough of those people in enough seats to win an election. Of course, there were particularities in the Hartlepool result, including the vaccine bounce. However, I think probably both our speakers and Andrew, if he joins us, would agree it's probably more reflective of significant changes in the electoral landscape in the UK. In my opinion, and this comes across in the paper, the key to these long-term or at least understanding these long-term and complex changes which are taking place is probably the word Brexit, even if it's not directly resulted to the 2016 elections. Why is that? Well, broadly speaking, as the paper argues, Labour now seems to stand for what can be easily caricatured as Remain values, so urban, progressive, outward-looking. And the Tories increasingly represent Leave values, traditional, socially conservative, patriotic, and distrustful of globalisation. What is more, the Conservatives have the Leave brand all to themselves, of course, whereas Labour have to share the Remain or the progressive EU brand with the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and the Scottish Nationalist Party. These analyses, which will be interesting to hear what people think, are, I'm fairly sure, shared by the Labour leadership and strategists, which explains why after the Hartlepool result, Keir Starmer and others were very cool. But Keir Starmer shares this analysis because immediately after the election, of course, he started talking about going to visit the Red Wall states in the summer and listening to voters and trying to win them back. Whereas Peter Mandelson, who was a stalwart of New Labour, even talked about the need for the Labour Party to embrace so-called Brexit values. I argue this misses the point in two key ways. First of all, yes, Labour does need to reach out to its former heartlands, but it shouldn't do so myopically or obsessively. Because if it does, well, it certainly shouldn't try to embrace Brexit values, but if it does, then there's a very high likelihood that it will lose potential new voters in the south of England and in the major cities. And we saw that, I think, in the Emersham by-election recently, where people who had been turned off by the Conservative Party were not necessarily turned on by the Labour Party, and this obsession with the Red Wall states. So Labour needs to, instead of trying to reconstruct old coalitions, I would argue, construct a new broad-based coalition. And lastly on this, I would say, as somebody from a Red Wall seat, in this case Hull, I also think it's slightly insulting to suggest that everybody across the north of England will react well to leave values. Really, in my experience, people across the north of England react to exactly the same as other people react to in the UK, which is they want good jobs, decent living standards, a feeling of pride in the community, good prospects for the kids, and a life of dignity. Okay, so on to messaging. So in a national political context, messaging means two things, according to my experience working as a communications consultant. Firstly, it means narrative, and then it means messaging and policy around that narrative. There were lots of explanations about what happened in Hartlepool. Some of them, well, many of them broke along factional lines. It was about Jeremy Corbyn, or it wasn't about Jeremy Corbyn. It was about the fact that Keir Starmer has broken with what one Labour MP called a popular manifesto from the last election, even though that manifesto led to a significant defeat. So what, in my opinion, actually happened is a more compelling argument, I think, is that people on the doorstep, and I think we're hearing this again in Batley, repeatedly ask the same thing. What does Labour stand for? What does Keir Starmer stand for? I mean, Labour did have a tagline going into the Hartlepool by-election, and it was, as Keir Starmer said, your priorities will always be our priorities. But as Ian Dunt has noted, that kind of political language easily degenerates into placatory nothingness. I mean, it means nothing, but what they were saying. So what do we need in terms of a narrative? There was a great article in the New Statesman by Qasim Qassam, which he said humans are essentially storytelling animals. We make sense of the world we live in by telling stories that aspire to the truth. And this is both a truth as in the literal truth, but also a felt truth. Do narratives chime with our lived experience as people? Do the narratives help us explain our lived experience and put ourselves into a bigger sense of the world beyond just our immediate lived experience, which can also, of course, be a difficult lived experience. So a narrative is a story that tries to make sense of the world. And as we know from the Leave, from the EU referendum back in 2016, resonance, so a narrative does not necessarily have to be based on truth. And that's an awful thing to say. I work in human rights, but it is the case. And we saw that with the Leave campaign, which was full of lies, but those lies resonated with people and gave people a sense of how they felt about their own lived experience. So there needs to be a narrative. At the moment, I really think there isn't in the Labour Party. So one key step that Labour needs to take is to answer the question, what's the story? How do we combine, how do we move from criticising the government to presenting a compelling narrative like New Labour did in the 1990s, which was one of collapsing standards, and Labour promised regeneration or rebirth, really, of the UK. Secondly, around this narrative, you can build key messages, which of course is essentially policy messages. And here again, Labour has been criticised over the past year for not really having a coherent set of policies. We, with Anne and Labour International, have been sending lots of ideas for policies in, but it seems to be a bit of a black hole. Things go in, they don't necessarily come out. Unfortunately, I think Keir Starmer has realised this, and he now has started talking about strengthening the policy review process. I saw Labour came out with a roadmap, which wasn't anything incredible, but at least, focused on things like education, equality, a rights-based foreign policy, decency in politics, etc., etc. So maybe there's a start of that, but there clearly needs to be a lot more work done on developing that that policy framework, really, to attract voters. Lastly, and this is my last point, tactics. How do we get there? The only thing I would say here is that at the moment, the Labour Party seems to be caught in this spiral where it's only criticising the government and isn't then going the next step and offering something better. A good example is the EU. Labour seems petrified of actually talking about Brexit or talking about the EU, or pointing out the terrible damage being done by the government's very thin Brexit deal. But they shouldn't be, because they need to, you can't avoid these discussions. And I know Will has said the same thing before. But that doesn't mean you have to, go on full on and attack Brexit. What it means is point to the flaws in the government's deal, point to the consequences of that, but then offer something better. Make the very truthful assertion that this Conservative government could never develop or negotiate a better deal with the EU because the EU don't trust them. Only a Labour government could construct a closer and more sensible relationship, which polls show that's what the government wants. And lastly, on government sleaze, the same thing. Keir Starmer's major sleaze jibe at Boris Johnson hits home to an extent, but there's no follow-up. There's no, assertion, and this again I think is true, that it will always be like that under this Conservative government, and only a Labour government could bring truth and decency and public standards back into political life in the UK. And I'll stop there, Anne. Thanks.
So a lot of time with Andrew Adonis actually at the weekend, so I do know his views, and I'm happy to retail them if in his absence, give you a kind of give you a kind of abbreviated version of what Andrew thinks, which is broadly that Keir is not going to succeed in a general election, and he hasn't got what it takes in Andrew's view. I think he can spell that out for you himself. And but I do think the situation in the Labour Party is incredibly grave at the moment. I think the tomorrow in Batley and Spen, the fact that 6,000 votes from the kind of independent, what would they call, Woollencraft, kind of a very right-wing group. There were 6,000 people voted for them, and there was the Brexit vote. They overwhelmed the Lib Dem vote. they will go to the Tories. And I think the chances of winning Batley and Spen are very low indeed. And I do think that it will open up some really difficult conversations in the Labour Party. We know the party. It doesn't have a tendency to be ruthless, and there's not a crown prince or princess in the offing. Andy Burnham hasn't got a parliamentary seat, and it may be, as Sky reported this morning, that 69% of Labour Party members, I don't know how big the poll was, but 69, it was how big the sample size was, but 69% of Labour Party members would prefer to see Andrew Burnham leading the Labour Party than Keir. I mean, this is not a good moment for Keir's leadership. I agree with a lot of Mark's paper. I mean, Boris Johnson is being buoyed up by the sense the government is doing something. The government is making announcements all the time, and the vaccine program has been successful. I mean, I hesitate about this because, but my own view is that the enthusiasm to unlock completely on July the 19th, or as near completely as damn it, is a big mistake. And nobody knows what proportion of the population you need to get herd immunity. But the World Health Organization wouldn't commit themselves, but we guess that it's above 80%, and it could be as high as 90%. And so going for a full opening with only 65% of the population having a double jab, as they will have by July the 19th, is a really high-risk strategy. And it may blow back on Johnson. But I mean, and it was also interesting, I thought, that the Andrew Mitchell amendment on foreign aid, trying to reinstate the foreign aid budget to 0.7%, that he was so confident he would win it had he got the Speaker to allow the Tory rebels to have a vote. And there are this coalition that he leads is extremely, uneasy. You have people like Theresa May and others who will never forgive him for that way he behaved in the run-up to December 19, and those hatreds, and they are run very deep and visceral in the Tory party. You've got upward of 80 MPs who are in red wall seats or former red wall seats, and they want more of the kind of activism that has produced the Ben Houchen effect, the mayor of the Tees Valley, who won an astonishing 73% of the electorate in the Tees Valley voted for Ben Houchen. I mean, in what used to be kind of Labour heartlands, it is extraordinary. And Ben Houchen himself is something of a phenomena. And I think the electoral leaflets in Hartlepool, in a sense, tell you all you need to know. On one side of the leaflet, there was Keir and Angela Rayner taking the knee in the Leader of Opposition's office. And on the other side of the leaflet, there were Ben Houchen's achievements in the Tees Valley. And, who are you going to vote for? And with Brexit having kind of, as Mark's paper says, having weakened people's reflex willingness to vote Labour, I mean, the whole thing opened up. And it really is extraordinary in the northeast of England. I mean, you have in that area, there are kind of 7 parliamentary constituencies, which all used to be held by Labour, including Sedgefield. Now there's only one. And it is the kind of bridgehead into the kind of red hall that Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson want to exploit. And they're doing it with this levelling up and build back better agenda, a sense they are activist, and a sense that their vaccine program is successful. but they're there for the taking. I mean, it's Johnson is increasingly distrusted. That he had been instrumental in Matthew Hancock taking his decision to resign on Saturday, when everyone knew on the Friday he said the matter was closed. This man, even ordinary men and women who don't follow politics clearly and closely like we do, kind of know this man habitually lies. And I think it's been one of the byproducts of Brexit. As I said in a column I read on Sunday of The Observer, find it on the Guardian online if you haven't seen it. But I argued that the kind of big side effect of Brexit, biggest side effect of Brexit, has actually been a collapse of integrity and decency in British public life, because so much of the story has been built on lies, lies beget lies. And someone like David Frost, who's the Brexit Minister of the House of Lords, famously wore Union Jack socks to the G7 summit in Cornwall, that he manages to kind of get the wrong side of Elton John, as he did in the House of Lords yesterday. No certainty of touch, these people. So they should be there for the taking. And you can't help but feel that actually in the next period, next 12 months, we're actually managing our way out of the pandemic, learning to live with COVID, and which demands some sophistication, alongside some sophisticated interventions to kind of alleviate the worst of it, notably educationally. I mean, I thought the educationist who resigned, Kevin Collins, who resigned over a 15 billion price tag being reined back to 1.5 billion, and getting evidence again yesterday saying that it's nugatory what the government is doing. All of this is kind of opening, but for Labour. But and here I think the paper. I'm not sure I agree with this element in the paper. The Observer's opinion poll on Sunday had 27% of the UK population would like to rejoin. Another 22% would like to have a closer relationship with the European Union. Only 20% want a more distant relationship. Another kind of 20% think things are fine as they are. There's no majority for a hard Brexit, and there's no majority for the way this Brexit's being managed. And actually, I think it's a category error to fish in the same pool of voters that Boris Johnson is fishing. And it's no accident that Keir's fortunes began to go south when he voted and whipped the Parliamentary Labour Party to support the treaty in the vote between Christmas and New Year in this December. And from then and it was a mistake at every level. It was a mistake in terms of his own integrity as a politician, because we know he doesn't believe that. He's a pro-European. He isn't in favour of the treaty. Secondly, you can't turn the Labour Party from being a pro-European party to a kind of living with Brexit party at the stroke of a pen. It's actually not actually where the beating heart of Labour voters and Labour activists lie. It's a repudiation of what we stand for and what we believe. It made him look kind of false, because what the devil does he believe? And it disallowed him and the front bench from criticising the events of the last 6 months as aggressive as they should have been criticised. And I personally, I I don't want to think this because I like Keir personally, and he's a really decent guy. But I think that was such a mistake, and such a strategic mistake by the people around him. And actually, he has got the message. He sacked some of them who were urging him to make that decision. But that doesn't, in a way, no one cares who's doing what in Lotto, as it's called. He's the man who made the call. And it may be that he now thinks that those who insisted that he did kind of insist that the Labour Party voted the treaty, that was a mistake. He probably recognises it. There's no way back once you've made a mistake of that epic nature in British politics. What should the so where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? I mean, I think there will be a leadership challenge. Keir may be lucky, and it may come from the left, and he may see it off. And in the act of seeing it off, he may kind of answer some of the questions that Mark poses in his paper. I mean, who is he? What does he believe? But it is, as one former leading Labour figure texted me, and I was shocked by the text, said that it is really incredible that Keir has, I'm not going to disclose who he or she is, it is incredible that Keir has said absolutely nothing interesting about the future of Britain in his tenure as leader of the opposition, at a moment when the future of the country is kind of more contested and more up for grabs and more interesting than at any time for years. And I think one of his problems, and one of the problems of the party, I think, is that actually, and I felt this for ever since I wrote the State Room and watching the Blair administration. It kind of, I'm not sure the Labour Party has known for decades what it really thinks. I mean, I don't think. What does it mean to be socialist in 2021? What does that mean? Now, I have my own particular array of passionate things that I argue for. You all know them on the call. I really believe that the Labour Party has to take on 21st century capitalism in the name of everyone. But I don't believe it can feasibly argue it's going to transform capitalism or socialize it. It's going to reform it. And there are two things which are really on top of front of my mind at the moment, which relate to what should always be a kind of issue for us on the left, which is who owns capital and who owns land. There are 4.5 million leaseholders, many of whom can't sell their flat because of the cladding crisis, and many of whom have signed leaseholder contracts in which the freeholders still have immense power under medieval law, property law, where ground rents and service charges double every 10 or 20 years. They're called doubler contracts. My daughter has inadvertently signed one. She cannot sell her flat. And there are hundreds of thousands of people like that now. Meanwhile, private equity is kind of circling our quoted companies. And I mean, I actually, the public company is a fantastic building block for stakeholder capitalism. But the number of quoted companies has shrunk from 4,000 in 1980 to 1,000 now. And the number of companies that you can invest in a pension fund to get an income stream in retirement is shrinking all the time. And that income stream is being commandeered, as Morrison's profitability will be if this American private equity company succeeds in taking it over. I mean, they will kind of land it with an enormous kind of debts. They will insist it pays like dividends, and they will become extraordinarily rich. But that's an income flow. I mean, apart from what it'll lose the workforce and all the rest of it, is just in a sheer kind of democratic capitalism, that's an income stream that is being denied ordinary men and women. But someone like, I mean, not even Ed Miliband, I think, understands this well. It feels confident enough to kind of, I don't know why Rachel Reeves and Keir and Ed Miliband and none of them feel confident enough to kind of say, let's talk property, let's talk ownership. Not because we want to socialize it, but it must be reformed. I mean, we cannot, as a country, continue kind of down this road we're going. And in particular, and I was very interested in the FT again yesterday, interviewing the partners of this private equity firm taking over Morrison's. And the journalist in question was saying, well, what are you doing as a private equity firm? You're only taking over kind of old economy companies like Morrison. Which the reply came, yes, that's the only option in the UK economy. It is an old economy. There's only one high-tech company in the FTSE 100, Sage. I mean, and the structures of British capitalism are extraordinarily biased around creating what economists call economic rent, from banking through property, through retailing, through digital platforms. That's what you find. And you kind of want the Labour Party to kind of get off its knees, really, and actually kind of insist that these economic structures are producing a malevolent capitalism, which certainly is not going to be able to exploit the opportunities of global Britain, and is throwing up very different wages and working conditions. And in parts of the country, I mean, living standards are barely higher than a less developed country. I mean, famine, hunger, collapse in life expectancy. I mean, I know that, many of you are living abroad. I mean, some of these places which voted for Brexit and which the Labour Party are trying to convert them to the cause, ask the question legitimately. We've voted Labour for 30, 40, 50 years, but what good has it done us? And at least if you vote Tory, as you do in the Tees Valley, a lot of money suddenly comes your way. And actually, Ben Houchin, Tory mayor, is having a stab at trying to reindustrialize the Tees Valley. Well, I do kind of get why they're doing what they're doing, and I do kind of get why a lot of people may vote for the Tory candidate in Batley and Spen tomorrow. So for me, I mean, there has to be a narrative about Wilsonian narrative, if you like, picking up some of the points that Mark makes in his paper. It is about a new economy, a high innovation economy, economy that in some of there's the space sector, which I know something about. There's the vaccines and med tech, where it's obvious that we're doing very well. I mean, there's robotics, there's batteries. I mean, there's a whole bunch of areas where actually, the UK could actually kind of really make waves. And the kinds of company that we want to construct in these new sectors is a stakeholder company, one that kind of treats customers, treats its workers, and has a purpose beyond making profit, which drives the leadership team and animates the workforce. You want that fed by reconfigured educational and training system, and a reconfigured transport system. It's not difficult to kind of really make quite an aggressive argument, which also links to the politics of constitutional change, which isn't just for nerds. It is actually about taking back control in people's ordinary day-to-day lives. And actually, well, again, I'll finish off. I'm 71 now, and I wrote the state we're in 1996, or it was published in 96. It was written a little earlier than that. And for the last 25 years, one way or another, I consistently feel that actually Labour leaders get themselves boxed into a kind of a Me Too position. So they have a variant of a kind of what the consensus has been constructed by the right and by the Tory party. But there's not a kind of an attempt to construct another consensus around left values, around liberal values, and really proselytize it. It's always kind of ducking and weaving, and and not standing your ground. And now, of course, you find in 2021, arguments I've made about stakeholder capitalism, arguments I've made about purpose in business, arguments I've made about constitutional change, are suddenly becoming mainstream. Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, talk the language now of the kinds of things I wrote in the state we're in, but didn't want to ever say kind of in their own right when they were in power. And some of them, and again, working class voters kind of in these red wall seats, they don't doubt the kind of good intentions and decency, I don't think, of kind of Labour politicians. But they do doubt their competence, and they do doubt their drive, and they do doubt kind of whether there's a kind of vision and a world they want to construct, which is distinct enough from the Tory world for them to back. And I don't know what man or woman is going to come forward on the Labour front bench who can say these things with conviction in the British public, to the British public. I don't know. Maybe I dream, but I don't think that if you stood in doorsteps across the Midlands and the north of England and laid out the ways in which the Tory party are gerrymandering the British Constitution to suit their interest, laid out the way in which it's a disgrace that so many of the blocks of flats that their kids want to buy a flat in Sheffield, in Leeds, in Newcastle, in Manchester, you don't know who the owner is because it's anonymized and offshore. And it's going to remain anonymized and offshore until actually someone gets brave about us saying, we want to know who owns our country. We're not, if you explain to working class voters in Grimsby or Hull the degree to which the current Conservative Party is financed by overseas donors, GB News, speaking for a Britain that allegedly kind of doesn't have its values expressed anywhere else except they're everywhere. And I always find that conceit of completely financed by foreign capital. I find this, we want to take back control of our borders, but we allow our assets to be pawned and sold aggressively. All comers who can anonymize once they've got control of the asset, who they are. If you're somebody have in a gig economy job in Hull, or you've been persistently out of work in Grimsby, you do get, you can be converted. We can do in the 21st century what the ragged trousered philanthropist did in the 19th century or the early 20th century, that great book, we can, there is but we have to, we have to be clear about our what our analysis is, and from which I think the messaging will come, and from which it can be done with some passion. And by the way, that includes rejoining the European Union, for God's sake. And actually trying to triangulate, as Keir has done, in trying simultaneously to appeal to Gradland and actually Red Wall voters, without having a kind of an articulated kind of critique of contemporary capitalism and a vision of actually what the good life would mean for ordinary men and women. I mean, it's hopeless. I've even begun to wonder for the first time, whether it's possible that they want to do this. Maybe, there's just too much baggage. Maybe it can't do it. So I both think that there's an enormous possibility at the moment, and there's for making great arguments that I think could carry the bulk of the Brits and actually carry us kind of not only to reconstructing and levelling up the country and holding parts of our Wales and Northern Ireland, and actually rejoining the European Union. I think it could be done. I think the ground is really fertile, but whether it will be done, and whether the Labour Party, as it's currently configured, is capable of doing it, is a really open question for me. Thank you.
How to follow that? I got completely absorbed, Will, in what you were saying and inspired at the same time. I'm, I guess, speaking as a party activist, as a communications professional like Mark, as a former Labour staffer. So I worked for David Blunkett 1995 to 1997. So I was there in working for the shadow cabinet when we were on the brink of power, and I really remember what that felt like. And I really want to get back to that place. I'm also have recently been appointed as a director of Progressive Britain, which some of you may have heard of. It's the newly formed think tank, which is looking to reinvigorate debate and discussion in the centre left of the Labour Party. I hopefully will build on some of the things that Mark and Will have touched on and try not to be repetitive, but I'm responding to some of the things that you set out in your paper, Mark. So this is the theory, the communications theory, which you set out, with one slight difference. You started, I think, with objectives. Well, we always start in comms these days with values and vision, and Will talked a little bit about kind of purposeful companies. So whenever you're doing any kind of analysis with companies at the moment, you really start with what are you here to achieve? What's your purpose beyond making a profit? And that's a really good thing. And there is absolutely a really clear trend to, businesses looking at their bottom line and seeing the way they treat their staff, the environment, society, is a key part of the value of that business. And that's a big theme that we can discuss a little bit more about. So values and vision are absolutely key to start with. What is it we stand for? What's our vision for society? What is it we want to achieve? We want to get elected. And then strategy. And this is, I think, for us where we're absolutely haven't got a clear strategy. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. And that comes back to some of the things that you talked about, Mark, early on. And only when you've got all of these things, clear vision, clear objectives, clear strategy, can you really start to think about, what the offer is, what our message is, what is it we're trying to say to people? And then lastly, how do we communicate it? So the good news, I think, and I share a lot of people's concern about the kind of state of the Labour Party at the moment, and I worry about what the future is for the party. But one thing that I think when I started to think about this today, actually, it's a very good exercise to start to think, to put your thoughts down on paper, is actually, I still think there's more that unites us as a party, and I still think that we have a really clear set of values. And I started to jot some of them down. And I think that if we sort of spent 15 minutes together as a group, we would probably come up with a set of values that we could all agree in. we want good public services, decent work, safe communities, affordable housing, opportunity for everyone, a fair economy, including some of the things that Will was talking about, and a sustainable future. You know, we might phrase them all slightly differently, but actually I think the Labour Party does stand for something. There are some really clear values. So the good news is, I think that we probably can agree on what we agree on as a party, and we ought to do that a little bit more, because there's a lot of division in the party, even in some of the comments today. You know, we would be much better to spend some time thinking about our values, what we share, what we agree on. And I think that would help. So values, tick. Now vision, I think there's a lot of criticism about Keir not having a vision, and I think to some extent this is true. So my analysis of this is that I think he genuinely wanted to unite the party, and he's tried to lead by building consensus, and that has clearly failed. And his only option now, if he's, you know, survives any leadership challenge post Batley and Spen, is to lead by clearly setting out a vision for the country. So I totally agree with what Will was saying. And how a Labour government guided by its values will improve people's lives in the context of the challenges. So I think this is, you know, if you remember Gordon Brown had this phrase, he talked about traditional values in a modern setting. And I think that's, we've always got to be reinventing ourselves. Our values don't change, but the way we express them has to, and what we think about that. And the challenge, I think, for him is that how he sets out, how he does that has to be driven by a kind of political strategy. And both Mark and Will picked up the kind of changing dynamic. There was one little graphic that I wanted to share with you, which I'm going to, hopefully it will go into the chat. Can you put graphics in the chat? I don't know. Let me see if I can.
You have to share screen, and then.
Okay, well, hang on a sec. I'll find it. Anyway, basically, it's very simple. It's a piece of polling from last week. It's a Mori poll, and it basically showed the leader satisfaction with Boris Johnson. And in that, it showed that those with a degree, he has a minus 26% net dissatisfaction. Those without any qualifications, it's a plus 17. And I think that if you can picture that, it shows the challenge that we've got around strategy. And it illustrates some of the points you were making, Mark, about how the kind of political coalition that you need to win, or Labour needs to win, is very challenging to achieve, because Brexit largely, but trends that have been coming for many years, have thrown everything up in the air. So getting a strategy is really challenging. How does Labour, that we can have this conversation, how does Labour build a coalition that can win in the context of where we are now? What is the coalition of the electorate that can deliver a Labour victory? And there's a huge amount of analysis that is necessary. What seats are genuinely winnable? How do we build a coalition with different groups of the electorate? And obviously it's in the context of a first past the post electoral system, so, and boundary changes that are going to change the electoral maths as well. And so I think that there's not been nearly enough thought about what that strategy looks like. And the challenge we have is that, you know, we are a party of Labour. We have come from the kind of working class, trade union, the roots, and those people have deserted us, and the people that are coming towards us are the people dissatisfied with Johnson, who have no traditional history of necessarily supporting the kind of traditions of the party. And so that's a really complicated and difficult conversation to have, and I think is at the root of many of the issues that we're facing at the party. So the support for the Tories in the Red Wall is holding up. They're losing their support amongst the educated, liberal, metropolitan elites, and that presents a massive challenge. So our traditional voters have deserted us. We're not targeting those that have lost faith with the government, because those are not our traditional voters. So the question is, should we? And if we do that, then you know, can we win, and what does that do to the party? And if we don't, then, you know, will we ever win? So I think that's why the party's in such a huge having such a huge challenge at the moment. But what is clear, I think, is that if you don't work out the coalition you need to win, then you and the people that you're trying to talk to, then you can't hone your message or your policies. And it's not possible to be all things to all people. And I think you only have to ask a Liberal Democrat to understand that. So I agree with Will. We need to be really clear who we are, who we're talking to, and what we're saying. And you, I think, Mark, summed up some of these things really nicely. You need a clear top line messages. So the Tories, is really clear what, you know, remember when everything was strong and stable with the Tories? That was very clearly their top line message. And currently we're levelling up and we're building back better. And those are owned by the Tories. Even though I think Andy Burnham might have talked about building back better first, actually, those are now very clearly clear top line messages for the Tories. And again, I don't know what ours are. I don't know what our top line is, other than the Tories are sleazy, and that's not really enough. Those messages need to be tested with your audiences. They need to be tested and tested again with the people that we're trying to win support from. So there needs to be it needs to back up the strategy. And one thing that I think we often forget in the Labour Party is your messages need to resonate with the people that you're trying to win over, not the party. And we spend an awful lot of time talking to ourselves and trying to convince ourselves and agree with each other. And really, we're talking to the wrong people. We need to sort of get over ourselves a bit. We need to, you know, agree that there's more that unites us than divides us, and work out how we're going to build a broader coalition than we currently have within the party, because it's not enough to win an election. So, and then, of course, when you've got your top line, then you need to drive policies. Now, my experience of working for the Labour shadow cabinet between 1995 and 1997 was the unbelievable amount of discipline there was around what was said, which we have. And obviously, we're in a completely different world now because we've got many forms of communication. But you know, there was if you were in a shadow team, you were not allowed to say anything without it being cleared by Gordon Brown. You were not allowed, everything was tested. I mean, it was incredibly tight. And there was good reason for that. And it's not replicable now, but we need to kind of work out what the modern equivalent is. So all policies that are announced need to reinforce your message. And because we know that that's the only way. Elections are not won or lost in the 6 weeks of the campaign or even the 2 months beforehand. They're won and lost over the course of a much longer time frame, and by the consistent pushing of messages out. So, you know, policy announcements need to reinforce messages, and there needs to be a whole nother level of discipline about how you manage the message. And I don't know, I mean, the Tories are very good at that. And I think we are really, really poor at it. And I'm not quite sure why or what's going wrong. Again, it'd be interesting to have a conversation about that. And only at that point, really, do you have to worry about the actual communication. So how do you get the message to the intended audience? And we now have many multiple channels, and it's a very, very complex task of ensuring that the message that you're trying to get across is actually hitting the people that you need it to hit. And then lastly, and this is, I thought it would be interesting to put this into the pot because we never really talk about it, but you need to, it's really important that you evaluate what people heard. So we spend an awful lot of time kind of working out what we want to say as comms professionals, and anyone that's involved in policy or campaigns or communications. We spend very little time working out what people actually heard. And I think that there's a lot that we can, there's a lot of work to do to have that feedback loop much more effective. And I think social media doesn't help because we live in a little goldfish bowl, an echo chamber where we hear from, and not just on Twitter, but on lots of social media. The algorithms mean that you basically get the feedback that you want from the people that are like you, rather than necessarily the ones that aren't like you that you're trying to talk to. And focus groups are useful, but potentially a bit more limited. So we need to think about really hard how you test what people heard, because quite often what you say and what people hear are different things. So I think I guess where am I going to sum up? I'm ready to be inspired. I'm not sure that a new leader is going to change a lot of the things that we need to solve as a party. I think that Keir's had a challenging year. I think that he's not, his initial strategy of kind of leading by consensus has clearly completely failed. I personally would give him an opportunity to go away and set out his vision and see what he comes up with when he wants to be his authentic self, because I don't think that that's what he's really done so far. So that's where I think I will leave it, and I'm really interested to know what people on the call think. Just thank you to everybody and for all your comments, and it's a really interesting conversation, and particularly picking up hello to Laura, nice to see you, and just on what Neil and Laura and the discussion in the chat about the Progressive Alliance. I think that is the difficult conversation that the Labour Party needs to have. You can't have what is our strategy for winning? Can it be done without a Progressive Alliance? Can it be done without Scotland? And then we need to have really difficult conversations about what our strategy is for winning. So hopefully that kind of contextualizes some of the things we're saying. I did want to also I can't remember who it was, but someone talked about the importance of the messenger. So the good communicators of the past, and how important it is to be able to communicate what you're saying really clearly. And I 100% agree that it is important to have a good messenger, but the message is also really important. And actually that modern communications, the way in which you can get messages to people, is not confined to people delivering messages, because a lot of that is consumed via social media. So the messenger is important and the team around them is important, but message discipline is probably more important, and making the best use of all of the channels of communication that we currently have, which we are not doing, is probably equally important. So I agree a lot with everybody. I'm grateful to Colin for the instant feedback and saying that you don't agree with me. It's a shame we're not in a room in person, because we'd be able to find some common ground, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you everybody. It's been really interesting to be part of your meeting tonight, and good luck for the rest of your session.
I'll be really brief, and just to thank everybody for participating. I thought, as always, it was a fascinating debate. The speakers were excellent, and all of the comments were very interesting. I'm not usually considered radical, but I must admit I found myself nodding with all of the kind of bold statements that we as a party need to be bold, whether it's focusing on constitutional reform, whether it's focusing on the iniquities in the current economic model, whether it's, as the last speaker said, being far bolder on our European future, or whether it's some of the bold assertions by Laura and others about kind of institutional reforms within the Labour Party when it comes to shaking up the parliamentary party or shaking up how the party communicates. I think, the reason all of these things were being said is because of the dire state of the party at the moment, and probably only a brush to take out all of the old and bring in the new is going to work. Just